The missing 411 theory has been a good way for cases that might otherwise be overlooked to reach fresh eyes. Some of these cases may never be completely solved, with people always wondering about some aspects of the mystery, but it's hoped that some of these questions may one day be answered. Number 10. Some of the strangest missing 411 cases are those where a missing person is eventually found in a location that doesn't make any sense. It was this element that made a lot of people who came across the case of Jacob Gray associate his disappearance with the mysterious phenomenon. Jacob was 22 years old at the time of his disappearance in April of 2017. He was originally from Santa Cruz, California, and was described by his family as a keen outdoorsman. He was especially interested in surfing, but loved to be in the water, either surfing in it or riding through it. There were many occasions when Jacob would take out his bike during rain, and his family believed he found it almost invigorating. At the time of his disappearance, Jacob was living in Port Townsend, Washington with his grandmother. He was preparing to make a cross-country trip to Vermont, where his brother was stationed with the Coast Guards. It was a journey he expected to take a couple of years. He was preparing to work odd jobs and seasonal work during the trip. Before he headed east, though, he needed to do a shakedown of his bike. The bike was a red Specialized hard rock with 2 milk crates bolted to a rack behind the seat. He had a child's trailer which he towed behind. When filled with all the equipment and supplies for the trip, the entire setup would weigh more than Jacob did. He'd been told it wasn't the best suited setup for his trip, but it would get the job done. On the evening of April 4th, 2017, Jacob left his grandmother's house and cycled into the rain. Over the next couple of days, he was spotted a few times, always on his bike. He was spotted a couple of times on April 5th, and at 1 o'clock in the morning on April 6th, still on his bike and towing the trailer behind him. Later in the morning on April 6th, a woman driving in the Olympic National Park passed him. The road is a winding and scenic drive through the forest. It connects Route 101 in the north to a series of trailheads upriver. During the afternoon, the same woman made a return trip and spotted Jacob's bike and trailer at the side of the road. It was roughly 6.3 miles upriver from the 101, some 4 miles further than Jacob had been when she last spotted him. Jacob himself was nowhere to be found. The scene was strange, and the woman took a few photos before continuing her journey. Over the next few days, park staff spotted Jacob's bike and belongings, unmoved at the side of the road. It looked like a lot of his things had been laid out on a tarp, and arrows had been stuck into the ground in a line going from east to west. A brief search of the area turned up no sign of Jacob, and eventually Jacob's family were contacted. At first, it was believed that Jacob may have gone to the river to collect water and slipped in. A stretch of water reaching 12 miles downstream was searched, including a number of log jams that would have prevented anything traveling in the water too far. Nothing was found in the water, though there were signs that somebody had scrambled out of the river a little downstream from where Jacob's belongings were found. The search for Jacob was largely organized by family, as there weren't enough clues for park staff to narrow down where to search for him. For over a year, his father spent most of his day searching more and more unlikely places for Jacob. There was hope that he might have been camping in the woods and had decided to live off the grid for some reason. That hope was dashed in August of 2018, when a team of biologists found Jacob's remains on a ridge above Hoe Lake, 15 miles from where he was last seen. It's extremely unusual for a missing adult to go up a mountain after they get lost, but it seemed like that was exactly what Jacob had done. There was no explanation for how he got there or why he had abandoned his bike. Jacob still had a lighter with him and ample food supplies, but there was no evidence that he'd set up any kind of campsite at that location. A cause for his passing couldn't be determined, though there didn't appear to be any signs of foul play. In this case, Jacob's remains only led to more questions about what happened to him, but it did allow his family to give him a proper burial. Number 9. 25 years since he vanished, there's been little progress in the unsolved case of Walter Greg Fowler. Greg vanished without a trace after telling his wife he was going on a fishing trip. Months after he vanished, the police announced that they believe foul play may have been involved in his case. But no evidence for this or any other cause of his disappearance has ever been uncovered. Greg was 44 years old at the time of his disappearance and lived in Bowling Green, Kentucky with his wife Deborah. From the outside, they appeared to be a completely normal couple. Greg worked as a lineman at Farmers Rural Electric Cooperative, where he'd been employed for 20 years. His wife managed a Dollar General. Greg rarely called in sick to work and seemed to be dedicated to his job. So it was strange when on June 18, 1999, someone called Greg's work to tell him he was feeling unwell and wouldn't be coming in. At least one source claims that it wasn't Greg himself who made the call, but a family member. The following day, Greg told his wife that he was going on an overnight fishing trip with some people from work. This was also out of the ordinary, as Greg wasn't especially interested in fishing. His friends would later tell investigators that Greg preferred to go turkey hunting or golfing. But it wasn't completely unheard of for him to go fishing, and Deborah didn't find it too strange when he left with his boat to Barren River Lake. A few days later, Greg still hadn't returned home. Deborah tried to report him missing and was initially told she had to wait 24 hours. Deborah decided to start the search for her husband herself. None of her friends had seen or heard from Greg since he'd left for his fishing trip, and nobody knew of any plans he might have had. His co-workers weren't even aware that he'd gone on a fishing trip. On June 21st, a state official at Barren River Lake offered to meet Deborah there so the official search for Greg could begin. On her way there, she spotted a boat capsized in the river, 2 miles downstream from the lake. Some sources say that it had already washed ashore, while others say Deborah and a passing work crew dragged the boat to the shore. There was no motor or any oars in the boat, but it was possible to identify it as the one Greg had taken out days earlier. Investigators found Greg's minivan at another boat slip, but found no clues as to what had happened to him. There were no provisions in either the boat or the van that indicated Greg had intended to make an overnight trip, which only helped to raise suspicions. The river where Greg's boat was found was relatively shallow, and the police believed that his body would be quickly found if he had ended up in the water. When that didn't happen, they began to think foul play was involved. It emerged that Greg and his wife were $250,000 in debt at the time of his disappearance. Greg had a life insurance policy, though it's not clear whether that would have been able to clear the debts. And Deborah wasn't even aware of this until Greg was declared as having passed in 2008. Deborah was initially considered a suspect in the case, and the police believed she may have had help from her son to take Greg's life. There was never any evidence for this though, and the case today is cold. Greg remains missing, and his family and friends continue to search for answers. He's described as being 5 foot 8 inches tall and weighed 200 pounds when he vanished. He was last seen wearing a gray Wildcat t-shirt, black shorts, and a camouflage print hat. Anybody with information can contact the Warren County Sheriff's Office at 270-842-1633. Number 8. One of the most puzzling aspects of many cases tied to the missing 411 theory is that they often feature people who are experienced in the outdoors and theoretically have the best chance of surviving if something strange were to happen while in the wilderness. Patrick Terrence Wallen fits into that category as an experienced outdoorsman and a survivalist who went missing in the wilderness. Patrick was 33 years old when he went missing from Glacier National Park, Montana, in November of 2000. It was an area he was familiar with. Patrick was originally from Cleveland, Ohio, and studied to become a nurse. He worked at a hospital for a while, but was always drawn to the outdoors. He quit his job to go hiking along the Pacific Crest Trail, raising money for the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation in the process. He later moved to Portland, Oregon, and frequented the nearby mountains and parks. Patrick was studying to become a doctor of naturopathy, a form of alternative medicine that focuses on nature. In the fall of 2000, Patrick spent a lot of time in Glacier National Park, the Blackfeet tribal lands, and the Columbia Falls area of Montana. Normally, most activity in Glacier National Park ends by the end of October, but Patrick was apparently still drawn to the area even as November began. The last confirmed sighting of Patrick was on November 2nd, though it's not clear where exactly he was seen or by who. His vehicle was later found at Lake McDonald Lodge restaurant at the eastern edge of the park, near the Blackfeet Indian Reservation. It had clearly been parked there for a while, but there were no clues in the vehicle about what Patrick was doing and when he had intended to return. It wasn't until May that any further clues about what had happened to Patrick turned up. A park ranger located the remains of a campsite located in a designated camping area of the park. The campground was located near the North Fork of Cutbank Creek, between Bad Marriage Mountain and Medicine Grizzly Peak. Rangers found some of Patrick's personal belongings at the campsite, and they were able to confirm that he had been there at some point. Unfortunately, the camp had been abandoned in the fall of the previous year, and around the time that Patrick had gone missing. If there had been any clues at the site, such as footprints, that evidence had long since been destroyed. Investigators were able to confirm that there was no sign of a struggle at the site, and it seemed as if Patrick had willingly left it, leaving behind his personal belongings. Search teams and sniffer dogs spent 2 days at the campsite, trying to find any other clues about where Patrick might have gone next. No clues were uncovered, and the case went cold. It's remained that way ever since. Unfortunately, there are few details related to this case that have been made public, making it difficult to figure out what might have happened to Patrick. Even the most skilled outdoor person can run into trouble due to the weather, or suffer from a fall of some kind. What's more strange is the fact that neither Patrick nor any of the belongings he had with him have been found in the years since he vanished, even though the park remains a popular destination, especially in the summer months. Anybody with information in this case is asked to contact the Glacier County Sheriff's Office at 406-873-2711. Number 7. One of the factors that can hold up the investigation into a missing person case is the fact that adults have the right to disappear. It can be difficult for investigators or even friends and family to know whether a missing person is in actual danger or if they want to disappear. The disappearance of Randy Rasco switched from being a missing person case to an intentional disappearance, and back to a missing person case over the span of 6 months. Randy originally disappeared in late May of 2015. He lived alone in Bowling Green, Kentucky, where he worked at the city's Department of Public Works. In early May, his brother Scott and sister-in-law came to visit and spend some time fishing with Randy. There seemed to be nothing out of the ordinary about him, and there was no reason to believe this was the last time they would hear from him. A few weeks later, Scott tried to call his brother multiple times but got no response. After a few days of silence from Randy, Scott contacted Randy's work to see if they'd heard from him. It was only then that he learned Randy had taken a vacation, and his work had no idea that he was missing. When Randy's family went to investigate his home, they found that he'd packed up his belongings and cleared out his apartment. He had arranged a P.O. box for all his mail to be forwarded to, but left no information about where he was going or how anybody could contact him. Randy was reported as a missing person, and the investigation to find him began. A few months later, the police caught up with Randy in Washington. He told them he'd simply wanted to get away for privacy reasons. Randy hadn't broken the law, and the police had no reason to suspect he was in any danger, so they left him be. The case was solved, and Randy's family respected his wishes and left him alone. Months later, staff at the Mammoth Cave National Park noticed a vehicle that had been parked outside the visitor center, untouched for 2 weeks. It was November 19th when the investigation into the car began, and they were soon able to pinpoint Randy Rasco as the owner. When staff contacted Randy's family, they realized that he hadn't been seen or heard from since his initial disappearance months earlier. Randy's family filed a missing person report again, and the focus of the investigation shifted to Mammoth Cave National Park. Search teams focused on an area within a quarter of a mile of the visitor center where Randy's vehicle was left parked, but found no trace of him. There was no sign of a struggle in the parking lot, and sniffer dogs were unable to find any scent that could lead investigators to the missing person. There was no evidence to say for certain that Randy was in the park, and he'd never booked any official tour. But many visitors explore the park without a guided tour. Randy and his brother would often go hiking, and it's possible that he didn't feel he needed the tour. It's also possible that Randy left the park by some means other than his own vehicle. 9 years on from Randy's original disappearance, no new information in the case has been uncovered, and he remains a missing person. Randy's family have asked anybody with information in this case to contact Park Watch on 888-219-1599 and leave a recorded message. Number 6. In the wilderness, it can take only a matter of moments for someone to disappear without a trace. Ronald Ohm had been hiking with friends at Russell Lake in the Willamette National Forest in Oregon when he was separated from the group and became lost in the wilderness. Despite extensive searches, first by his friends and then by official search and rescue teams, no trace of Ronald was ever found. Like so many people whose cases become tied to the missing 411 phenomenon, Ronald was someone who'd been hiking and camping many times. He was also familiar with the Russell Lake area and had come prepared for the trip. Ronald and his friends had been planning to camp by the water's edge, and Ronald still had all his belongings with him when he vanished. He was wearing a brightly colored backpack and was carrying a tent and sleeping bag, as well as food and medication for 4 days. He was 52 years old, and even though he had a medical condition that required daily medication, it was nothing that meant he would be especially at risk while out camping. On August 9, 2012, Ronald and his 2 friends were hiking on a ridge above the lake when they became separated. Ronald said he wanted to hang back and take some photographs of the lake. His friends carried on down the lake where they set up their camp. They didn't expect Ronald to be too long, but when night came and there was no sign of their friend, they knew that something was wrong. The search for Ronald began the following day, but they could find no trace of him. Ronald was reported as a missing person that evening. Search teams from the surrounding counties descended on Russell Lake to search for Ronald. Horses, SUVs, and ATVs were utilized in the initial search, with helicopters later joining the search effort to try and explore the more hard-to-reach areas. Flyers were posted at trailheads, and a number of hikers claimed to have seen him on the day he went missing. Unfortunately, this didn't help investigators to narrow down the search area much. The search was hampered by smoke coming from a forest fire. It wasn't close enough that it was likely to cause any danger to Ronald, but it did mean that it was harder for aircraft to be utilized. The fact that the search was mostly focused in an area between 5,000 and 7,500 feet above sea level and filled with valleys and crevices also made for a difficult search. Eventually, the search had to be called off. Another search on the anniversary of Ronald's disappearance also turned up no clues. His belongings should have at least been easily visible, but neither he nor his backpack or camera were ever located. Ronald is described as being 5 foot 11 inches tall, weighed 140 pounds, and was last seen wearing a blue shirt, jeans, and hiking boots with a beige hat and red and blue backpack. Anyone with information in this case should contact the Marion County Sheriff's Office on 503-588-5094. Number 5. In 2001, rangers found the remains of Randy Morgenson almost exactly 5 years after he had disappeared while on patrol in Sequoia Kings National Park. For some, this was the end of a mystery that was very personal to the search and rescue team that had looked for him. For others, there were still unanswered questions. Randy was a backcountry ranger who'd been coming to Sequoia Kings for decades. Every summer, he became part of the temporary staff that monitored the California National Park. It was a job Randy adored. He was an environmentalist and was passionate about preserving parts of the park, especially the meadows. He also had a good understanding of how the terrain and elevation impacted missing person investigations, and was one of the best at locking down a location to search when someone went missing. But at the start of the 1996 season, Randy's coworkers noticed that he wasn't in his usual good spirits. He was dealing with some problems at home, as his wife was in the process of divorcing him. He was also beginning to question whether his work as a backcountry ranger was worth it, and had a growing dislike for the tourists who didn't respect the park. Randy was last seen on July 21, 1996, when he left his tent at Bench Lake to go on patrol. He pinned a note to the flap of his tent, telling people he was on patrol. but mistakenly wrote June 21st rather than July. A few days after he was last seen, his supervisor began to grow worried. Randy had a park-issued radio with him, but there were many areas of the park where the radios didn't work. It wasn't the first time Randy had been away for a few days without contacting anybody. After 4 days of radio silence from Randy, the rest of the staff decided it was time to start looking for him. By this point, the area of land they would have to cover to thoroughly search for Randy was immense. Randy hadn't told them exactly where he intended to go, but they had some ideas of where he'd been before, and the sorts of places that he liked to visit. An intensive multi-day search began, utilizing sniffer dogs to try to track down the missing ranger. A few times it seemed like the dogs had picked up a scent before it suddenly stopped. Park staff also found items that could possibly have belonged to Randy, but they couldn't be certain. Unfortunately, the search for Randy had to be called off on August 4th. There were no clues that had helped narrow down the search after all that time, and there was also the possibility that Randy hadn't wanted to be found. On July 4th, 2001, a group of rangers located a weathered backpack near a pool beneath a waterfall. They also discovered a boot and then human remains hidden in the rocks. At the top of the falls, a park-issued radio was found. The radio was turned on, which meant that Randy was listening to conversations, or he'd been trying to call for help when something happened. Investigators believe he fell through a snowdrift and wounded his leg, but they also know they had passed the exact area where the radio was found multiple times without ever seeing it. For most, Randy's passing was a tragic accident, and a mountain in the park has unofficially been named after him. Others think there may have been more to his final days of his life than at first seems to be the case. Number 4. When Bill Ewasko went missing in Joshua Tree National Park in 2010, park staff believed it wouldn't be long before he was found. The official search turned up nothing, and it wasn't until 12 years later that his remains were located, just a mile away from help. At the time of his disappearance, Bill was 66 years old and living in Atlanta with his fiancée, Mary. Like many victims in these cases, Bill was at home in the outdoors and had been on plenty of hikes and climbs before. He had specifically been to Joshua Tree National Park in California many times, and was unworried about any potential dangers as he planned a solo hiking trip to the park. He'd given an itinerary of the places he planned to visit with his fiancée. It all seemed reasonable for him to accomplish during the week-long visit. He didn't specify when he was going to go to each place, but Mary knew that a location called Carey's Castle, an old miner's hut, was one of the places he wanted to visit first. The first day of Bill's trip was June 24th. He had told Mary he planned to spend the day on hikes, but would be finished by 5 p.m. He then intended to go to dinner at Pioneer Town. When 5 p.m. came, there was no call from Bill. Mary was immediately worried, as she knew that the hike to Carey's Castle could be dangerous. She tried to call him multiple times, but the phone only went to voicemail. She then tried to contact the park's headquarters to report him missing, but couldn't get through to them until almost 8 a.m. the following day. Joshua Tree National Park has many trails that crisscross one another, and caves and abandoned mines that can be traps for hikers. But most people that get lost in the park are found relatively quickly. The fact that Mary had a good idea where her fiancé had gone should have made it even easier to locate him, but Bill's car wasn't found at the trailhead that would have taken him to Carey's Castle, and there was no evidence that anybody had been there for weeks. It took almost 2 days to locate Bill's car at the Juniper Flats trailhead. Unfortunately, there were many places where Bill could have gone from that point. For days, search teams set out from the trailhead to try to find Bill. Helicopters with thermal cameras were used, as well as dogs. The only thing that was found during the search was a red bandana, which may have belonged to Bill. A few days after he was reported missing, Bill's phone connected to a cell tower, miles away from where his car was found. It only pinged once, and it was difficult to pinpoint exactly how far he was from the tower, as the topography of the region distorted cell signals. But it seemed to indicate, at that point at least, that Bill was alive. Unfortunately, the case went cold. The search for Bill was taken over by amateur investigators who spent years going over the park for any clues. It was by accident that Bill was finally found in February of 2022. He was miles away from where his car was found, in the south section of the park, and within sight of the road. The discovery prompted more speculation about what might have happened to him, and why it was so long before his remains were located. Number 3. Jordan Grider was only missing for roughly 6 months before his remains were found at an abandoned campsite in the Boundary Waters area of Minnesota. But the discovery of his remains only left people with more questions than answers, and led to some speculation of a supernatural explanation. Jordan had spent much of the past decade of his life living in the outdoors in New York and Kentucky. He would tell people that he wasn't homeless, but had instead made his home outdoors, living in the woods while managing to hold down jobs in the communities nearby. According to his family, he was super daring if he'd mastered the thing that he was daring to do. What other people might think of as extreme, Jordan could manage because he had spent so long practicing. When he went off into the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness in October of 2018, his family back home in New Mexico weren't especially worried about him. On October 8th, he sent them a photo of a beaver pond near his campsite and told them about how much grain and food he'd brought with him. The following day, he went out to purchase supplies at the nearest store, which was the last time anybody saw or heard from him. A few weeks later, authorities received a call about a white pickup truck parked across a private gate. When they went to investigate, they discovered that it belonged to Jordan. They contacted his family, who told him he was camping in the area and a brief search took place. There was no sign of the camper, but the winter weather hampered search efforts. It wouldn't be until April 19th that Jordan's camp was found, in an area that would have sheltered him from the wind. The campsite was long since abandoned, and there were signs that something disturbing had happened there. There were a lot of red stains in Jordan's hammock and sleeping bag, but the campsite hadn't been torn apart. Signs of wolves were found around the camp, but it seemed like they'd come after something had already happened to Jordan. When the snow melted, a small number of bones were found near the campsite. These would be identified by DNA as belonging to Jordan. Investigators believe that whatever happened to Jordan, it had happened on the first night of his stay. According to his family, Jordan liked to whittle wood, and there were no wood shavings at the camp. It was unlikely he'd been there for long. There was also evidence that he'd only started one campfire. There were a few possibilities about what had happened to Jordan, but each solution has holes. Jordan's family believe he was attacked by wolves, but experts have said this was unlikely to be the answer. Wolf attacks are extremely rare. On top of this, there likely would have been more signs of a struggle, even if Jordan had been attacked in his sleep, with rips in the hammock or surrounding tarp. But another possibility is that Jordan accidentally wounded himself while whittling or shaving. He kept his blades extremely sharp, and it's possible that one small nick could have caught something vital. But his blades were found still sheathed and had no signs of being used. The lack of obvious answers has led some internet sleuths to suggest that some paranormal creature of the woods was responsible for Jordan's passing. Wendigos or Bigfoot have both been suggested, as these creatures wouldn't necessarily leave behind the same traces of an attack as wolves. What exactly happened to Jordan will likely never be known, but his case serves as a reminder of the dangers to even the most experienced people of going camping alone. Number 2. Ice House Reservoir in El Dorado Forest, California is a popular hiking destination for families and those looking to enjoy themselves on the water. It should have been a relatively simple hike for Saeed Emadi and his friends, but when Saeed became separated from the group, he managed to get lost and disappeared without a trace somewhere above the lake. There was nothing about the location that made Saeed's family and friends believe he wouldn't come back to them when he left on the hiking trip on July 8, 2020. He was 66 years old and diabetic, but he was still physically fit and had good knowledge of the outdoors. He had never been to the Ice House Reservoir before, but nobody thought that would be a significant problem. The hike went well until Saeed and his friends crossed the Silver Creek near Strawberry Point on the far eastern point of the reservoir. Saeed became separated from his friends and found that he couldn't make his way back to them. He decided to carry on around the lake with the hopes of meeting back up with his friends sometime later, but somewhere along the way, Saeed became lost. Many hikers have commented online about how the Ice House Reservoir doesn't have a simple trail to follow, and it can be hard to navigate around the lake when the water level is high. It's possible that Saeed moved away from the lake while trying to find a way forward, or attempting to double back to get back to his friends. At 3:30 p.m., he called his friends to tell them he was lost. He said he was near a road and that the lake was beneath him. His friends contacted the authorities, optimistic that Saeed would quickly be found and rescued, but that wouldn't happen. The search for Saeed began relatively quickly, but no trace of him could be found. For 10 days, search parties walked around the lake for 24 hours a day. A few days after Saeed vanished, search teams found a boot print they believed that would have been made by the missing hiker. His family couldn't say for sure that it was the type of shoe that Saeed was wearing, but it was possible. The family hoped this new clue would quickly lead to Saeed's discovery, but it didn't lead to any tracks or any further clues. Even though Saeed knew what plants were forageable in the area, it's unlikely that he would have had his medication with him when he vanished. That meant there was a very limited time that search teams had to locate Saeed alive. After 10 days, the intensive search was called off with no clues found. 4 years on from Saeed's disappearance, he remains missing. He's described as being 6'2" and weighed 190 pounds when he vanished. He was wearing a plain white button-down shirt, plain white shorts, blue shoes, and a gray baseball hat. He was also carrying black and silver headphones when he vanished. Anyone with information in this case can contact the El Dorado County Sheriff's Office at 530-621-5703. Number 1. When 34-year-old Joe Wood went missing on Mount Rainier in 1999, he was the third person that year to have gone missing on the mountain. 25 years after his disappearance, he still hasn't been found, and the truth about what really happened to him remains a mystery. Joe was a New York-based African-American writer who'd made a name for himself writing intellectual and cultural pieces for The Voice and various other publications. At the time of his disappearance, he was writing a book on the black family in America, but was still continuing his journalism work and was even exploring writing his own fiction. In July of 1999, Joe and thousands of other journalists arrived in Seattle for the Unity 99 Journalism Conference, which was a week-long conference for journalists of color. It was an event Joe had attended previously and didn't seem to have any problems attending again. Heading for Seattle meant he could catch up with friends and fellow writers he didn't normally see, and he had plans to meet up with a few people during his stay. But Joe's time at the conference wouldn't last long. On July 8th, Joe decided to head out to Mount Rainier. Having grown up in the Bronx, Joe was not used to the untouched nature of the area and hadn't been on many hikes. He had visited Mount St. Helens in the past, though, and enjoyed going bird watching. Joe purchased a windbreaker and took a notebook and field guide with him to the snow-capped mountain. As the journalism conference continued, Joe's friends and coworkers started to worry when he didn't show up for planned meetings. Joe had a cell phone with him, but wasn't answering the calls. When the conference ended and Joe still hadn't checked out of his hotel room, his friends knew something was wrong. Joe was reported missing on July 12th. Soon after, his friends hired a private investigator to try to locate him. He'd only told one person of his intentions to hike around Mount Rainier, and it was almost a week after he was gone that his rental car was finally located. Another hiker claimed to have met Joe on the afternoon of his disappearance. They were at an area called Comet Falls, roughly a 3-hour hike from the start of the trail. Even though it was the middle of summer, glaciers topped the mountain all year round, and the snow at this point on the mountain was roughly 2 feet deep. Not much further up, the snow could reach as high as 8 feet. The hiker decided to make his way back to civilization, and Joe had told him he planned to do the same, but apparently Joe never made it back. The place where Joe was last seen was off the trail, but it gave search teams a good idea of where to look. Unfortunately, the weather made searching extremely difficult, and after a few days they had to suspend the searches to try again after the snow had melted. Years later, Joe still hasn't been found. It's likely that he simply became lost while on the mountain, or had fallen through a snow bridge and became trapped. Others have suggested that foul play might have been involved. It's impossible to say for certain until Joe is found. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But my name is Ty Knott, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.